Well, hello, everybody. How are we today? Let's see if I can get this. There we
Hey,
go. I got it
good
started
afternoon.
now. Hey, Vincent. Hey, Brandon. Hey, Vicky. Hey, Joseph. Welcome, you brand new agent. Good to see you. Well, I hope we're all ready for a good day. Do you know, as I was logging in, I was absolutely amazed. This is our 49th session on these class forms classes. So we're all we're all overloaded, I'm sure, with training. Hey, Lori, nice to meet you. Hey, Chad, how's it going today? Good,
Right.
good, good. That's good. All right. Oh, I think we had some winter weather this morning. What do you think? It was kind of nice to feel that brisk 32 degrees this first thing this morning. I'm sure y'all were excited too, but I kind of like that fall weather. Of course, I guess that's more like winter weather, isn't it? Uh, all right, we're going to today, instead of going right immediately to some of the new, some of the basic forms. Hey, Brandon, let's.
Hey,
I want to go through some of the addenda, okay, and a few of the forms that you might not use as often. And I know a couple of you are brand new on the class, but some of you have been with us for a few weeks, and I felt that it might be prudent for us to look at some of those addenda that you don't use all the time, but you know what? They're important to our transactions, and so let's just kind of take a look at those, and let's see if I can get you all up. I see that red wall behind you, Brandon. That looks pretty cool. I like that.
yeah, we gotta
Yesterday I
have our
was
dartboard up, and we'll go putt putt over here too. We gotta keep busy while we're making these calls.
I know it's your generation. I don't watch out about throwing at you.
I'm in the worst position because I got the dartboard right here, and Landon sometimes.
Yeah,
I've only been stuck like once or twice. It's
is
okay.
that right? I was on a call yesterday with one of the training calls, and one of the ladies had a purple wall. And
Oh,
I said, well, she said she'd like to have an accent wall. Well, that's good. That's an accent, okay. All right, let's pull up some forms and see what we can get into today. I think I about got this down pat now, how to do it. I am amazed that I'm beginning to understand a little bit more about it. So y'all hang in there and I'll try not to lose you. Ah, looky there. Looky there. And there you are. Yay. Um, Sometimes we have some variations in commissions. So I wanted to address the forms that we would use if we have a difference in commissions than what was agreed to, like in your agency agreements. Because when you write when you write an offer for a buyer in the buyer agency agreement, you do put an amount that you anticipate being paid. For generations, we have put 3% in there. However, in this last year, we have begin to see a different number in our MLS, and therefore we're going to have to learn some new scripts. But the main thing I wanted to point out to you today is not the script, but the form that you need to use. Occasionally, you'll have the opportunity to be paid more than was agreed in the agency agreement. And you say, glory, I like that sound. You don't see it often in this market, but in some markets, you might get a bonus either by a seller in the resale market, or you could possibly get a bonus through a builder. But don't hold your breath right now. I think things are going to change a little bit, maybe at the end of next year. But the form that you need to use anytime you get more than what's agreed in your agency agreement, you use Form 770. It's called Disclosure of Compensation. The compensation that they're referring to is what you're going to be paid in addition to what is in the agency agreement. So as you can see, it's a pretty simple little form. This is a form. Now, don't use this with anybody except your client. If you are getting paid a little bit more by somebody like the seller or the builder, you need to disclose it to your client. This form is only between you and your client. It's like an amendment to your agency agreement. All right. Again, it's Form 770. You are required to report and disclose to your client that you're getting more than he agreed to in the agency agreement. Okay. And again, you don't see very many things other than some a possible monetary bonus in your resale that you see in MLS, and it could be a percentage. There are a few, I've seen a few listings out there that were 3.5. And I would dare say that you probably didn't put anything more than 3. So you could have a 3.5%, or you might have, let's say, $1,000 on a bonus. I'm not seeing any non-monetary right now. The non-monetary would be like a Visa card from a builder. That's where you typically would see that. Again, when you come down here, you put the firm's name, you put your individual agent signature here, and come down here where the client tells you or acknowledges that you told him that you are going to get more than the agency agreement. And that's all there is to that little form. Just keep in mind, this form is only between you and your client. 770 is not used with other firms or other agents, okay? Occasionally I see this come in because the disclosure of compensation seems to imply something different, but it's only between you and your client. Now let's look on down here to the next one. The form that you would use if you are going to change the compensation that is offered in MLS. And this particular form is just between you and Valentine and another firm, okay? Let's say you are the buyer's agent and maybe Coldwell Banker, whatever, has a listing in MLS. And in that MLS, you are being offered 2.5%. But you want to reduce that 2.5 to 2% because you want to give a concession to your buyer. Now you can give a concession to a buyer because they are a party to the contract, okay? So if you give that 500, that 5% or half, well, not would be 5, it'd be 0.5%, wouldn't it? 0.5% to that buyer, then what we have to do is to come in here, you put Coldwell Banker and the agent, you and your firm, you would be the selling agent, and put the property description, the name of the buyer, and right here in this little area is where you would write something to the effect that the buyer agent commission of 2.5% that's offered MLS is being reduced by 0.5% or 0.5%. Okay, and that way, then once you have that established between you and the other firm, then you can get the buyer and seller to sign it. You do not have to. If you'll notice down here, the listing agent and selling agent are the ones who sign it. It is optional with the buyer and seller. I really like to have the buyer and seller sign it. I know it says optional, but I feel that they need to know what's going on in the transaction. And if there is a variation in the commission structure, it needs to be put here. Now, the one I'm seeing more than that, let's come back up here to these lines again. And right here, the buyer agent or the BA commission that's offered in the listing might possibly be 2%. And you're saying, oh, I don't want to work for 2%. I was counting on 3%. Well, I might settle for 2.5, okay? But they're only offering 2. So this is the form that you would need to present to the other firm as a request, only a request. What is offered in MLS is what's guaranteed to you. But if you want to ask for an increase, it would be right here where you would write something to the effect of the buyer's agent commission of 2% offered in MLS, and you want to put the MLS number is to be increased by 0.5% or 1%, whatever the amount is. And again, it has to be signed and agreed to by the other firm, and I'm advising that you get the buyer and the seller to sign it. This little form also can be used when you are possibly wanting to sell, let's say, a house in Wilmington. You don't have MLS access in Wilmington. You're not a member of the MLS in Wilmington, neither is our firm. So if you want to sell a house in Wilmington, I don't recommend a listing. But as a buyer's agent, you are licensed to be able to do that. But you don't have access to MLS. And the individual firm can decide if they will pay an outsider, if they will pay a commission to someone who isn't a member of their MLS. Most of us do cooperate, we do, and most firms do. I've run into 2 in the past few years who wouldn't, but nevertheless, what you want to do is use this form, and you would ask for whatever percentage that you're asking for on the buyer agent side, the selling agent side. And this would be the form that would confirm that you are going to be paid. Now, if you're selling within your MLS area, it's established. That's the one thing that's guaranteed in that MLS listing, is that you get paid what is in there. But if you're not a member of the MLS, obviously you've got to establish that, and it must be in writing. Do not think that you can verbally, or don't text it, and don't even put it in an email. Put it in this form 220. So to sell the house in Wilmington, you must have an agreement between the firm in Wilmington and our firm that they would pay you the percentage of the commission. There is no law that they can't. It is just it's a decision and a choice that each firm makes as to whether or not they pay outside. And quite honestly, it could be challenging to work with someone when you're, like, say, if you're going to try to sell something in Wilmington, to find a listing agent that will work with you and make sure that you can get into a house, and because you don't have showing time, you don't have key access, but it's not impossible. The important thing is to find a listing agent that will work with you and be willing to sell or pay you for selling the property. Okay. Again, this is form 220, and it is the form between firms, not between clients. All right. Now, without a shadow of a doubt, anytime you're going to speak to someone about writing an offer or talk to them about seeing properties, you're going to have to go with working with real estate agents. One of the reasons I showed you these other 2 forms first is that if you are going to work with someone that you need one of those forms, it's best to get it established before you actually present an offer for your buyer. So you might want to make sure that you have that established, particularly if you're outside the area. Now, the working with real estate agents disclosure, remember that became effective in July last year, and no grace period on this particular form. And it is a simplified version of the brochure that we have used since I've been here in real estate, and it's been a long time. So it was really a pleasure for us to see a simplified version rather than the cumbersome brochure that we have used. It was a threat to people because they would see all those words and it was just like, I don't want to understand all that stuff. So this simplified version is very helpful when you're using this version. And I did notice something, and I don't know, maybe I just overlooked it before. The number in the NCAR Library of Forms is 161 for the sellers, and it's 261 for buyers. And I did not notice that in the DocuSign, but I did notice that in the Zip Forms library. So just make sure that when you pull that document in, that it's the one that has either buyer or seller at the top, because one side supposedly is for buyers and one side's for the sellers. Just a little hint there if you were to happen to need the form number. It seems to be different in a couple of forms programs. Okay, let's go down here. The most important thing here is this form is not a contract. It is simply a disclosure. I can't stress it enough for you to stress to the people that you're talking with. And remember, it's the first substantial contact. When you first start talking about motivation, you start talking about what they can afford, what they really want. When you start having that conversation, you put your little hand up and say, wait, I got to talk to you about something first. And then you tell them how we in North Carolina work with clients or work with people as agents. So if you want to stop and go through this little simplified one page, and you do need to get them to sign it. All right. You can have them sign it in person, or if you're talking on the phone, or if you even in person say, I'm going to go back to my office and I'm going to send that over to you in our e-signature program. Is that all right? You can do it on the phone nowadays, but most of us like to go back to the office and do our paperwork. Okay, when you are talking to people about how you work in our firm, we obviously work with a buyer's agent with people who want to buy a property. We can also work as a dual agent, and we can work as a designated agent. Do not go into great detail on this. By and large, it's just overwhelming to try to understand agency. Even as agents, sometimes we get confused on agency. But as you read through this, you can see a way you can simplify the way you work with people. Right now, notice this, that any agreement between you and an agent that permits dual agency must be put in writing no later than the time you make an offer to purchase. You can't present an offer to purchase, period, until it's decided as to how you're going to be able to work. Okay, so don't even think about writing an offer until you have the buyer agency, until you have settled whether or not it's dual agency and or designated agents. Okay, let's write down here, make sure that you get it signed. There's the place for the buyer to sign. Oh, come on, baby.
Hey, Saber.
Yes, sir.
I know before, if they absolutely said I'm not signing, I don't care that it says it's not a contract. I don't want to sign yet. It doesn't happen. Actually, I can't think of it happening in a long time. But if it does, is there a place they can basically initial saying they're not going to sign? I know the old form there was.
The only thing you want to do is that the buyer or the prospect, client, customer refuse to sign and initial it and date it. Okay. That you actually did present it. We rarely do have that, but the commission will accept that because sometimes people just don't want to sign anything, But again, thanks for bringing that up, but rarely. But if it happens, you just make the statement, and if they ask them to initial it, but if they don't want to initial it, you initial it, okay, and date it. Make sure you have the date on it.
Okay.
All right, you are certainly welcome. All right, this is your buyer agency agreement. I'm not going to go through the buyer's agency agreement as thoroughly as we often do, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things, and then we're going to scoot on down to some of the other documents I wanted to show you today. One of the main things that I want to point out to you in this form, come on. Oh, it's been slow today. Could be the user. Uh, you always have to have a beginning date and an end date to make this agreement, to make an agreement valid. You got to have a beginning and end date. So you want to, here, you're going to put the date that you begin, and which is normally the day you sign the agreement. Now, we have two options now in our buyer agency agreement. The first option is when you're working with a client on one transaction. That's primarily the checkbox that you would check, because you are helping a buyer find a house to buy to live in, or maybe an investment, but most of the house to live in. Right now, if you are working with an investor or someone who is going to be purchasing multiple properties, you can check this box. In North Carolina, we do not have an automatic renewal. So when you're working with an investor, some of you work with investors, years, certainly months, and sometimes years, and they do not want to have to sign a new buyer's agency agreement every time they do a contract with you. And you can't duplicate the one that was signed previously. So they decided to put this provision in the buyer agency agreement. So now you have you can work with a buyer on multiple properties. However, you still need an end date. So I would suggest maybe 2 years. Okay, because if you're working with an investor, you could feasibly use one up to 2 years. So what, maybe a 2-year date out here. Whereas if you're working on one property, you may even just do 6 months. Can you use a buyer agency agreement for one specific property? Yes, you can. And if you did, you would put right here is where you would put the specific property address. It's rare, but every now and then you'll work with a buyer who says, no, I just want to work with one property. Occasionally you'll need to accommodate a buyer who doesn't want to go into a long-term commitment with you. They consider 6 month long-term. They might only want to go into an agreement with you for, let's say, 3 weeks or 6 weeks. This market might not allow you to have a reward for your efforts, because so many buyers right now are having to put multiple offers in to get a property, right? You're writing sometimes 5, 6, or 8 offers. So I would hesitate to start the procedure with somebody if they're not going to give you enough time to find the house. But legally you can. Okay. Let's scoot on down here. A while ago, I mentioned in 3%, that's for what the percentage that you're anticipating. I'm not going to go through that one today. Come on down here. The thing I really wanted to talk about are these two things right here. You want to make sure that you are confident when you express to a buyer that you are not going to violate fair housing laws. You're not going to violate any laws, I hope, but specifically right now, there's a real push, emphasis on fair housing. Okay. And as you can see, it's capitalized and it's bold. So anytime you see that, you want to read it and point it out to the client that this is something that you will be abiding by, and you anticipate that they will. Now, this next little thing here about the warning, anytime it's in red, it even says warning. Love letters have become a real thing. When a seller is looking at, when you say multiple offers, sometimes these multiple offers, I think one of our agents had something like 27 or 28. Can you imagine getting that many offers as a listing agent and your seller trying to understand? They couldn't even understand the spreadsheet, okay, that you had to put together. So, yeah.
We met with somebody that had 64 offers on a property we were competing with.
No way. Oh my land. 64. Oh, that was crazy. Oh my lands. And I thought 27 was outlandish. Well, most of them are not going to get quite that many, guys. But you are going to see multiple offers. So what happened was the public, somebody in the public, decided, well, let's try to relate to the seller. Let's not just win the bid on what we're offering. Let's see if the seller won't like us and favor us. So they write what we've come to know as love letters, but NAR calls them liability letters, because so often when you are trying to relate to a person, the seller, in that letter is fair housing violations. Even something as simple as using the word children. That astounds me that you can't use the word children. How many times the parents are going to want to write a love letter to say that they have children, they love the big backyard, they're going to love being across the street from the pool, whatever else they bring into children. Or sometimes they may want to say, my child is enrolled in such and such a school. And when you use such and such a school, like Catholic Latin or Charlotte Christian or Providence Day, there's some of these that are fair housing violations. One of the things that you have to watch for is even saying the word Y when it's an identifier for YMCA or YWCA. Sometimes even when you're putting in a listing in the MLS and you want to say it's close to the Y so that you can go exercise, you can't do that. The CMLS checker will take it out or tell you to take it out because that's fair housing violation. So because we don't really know how many words violate, we're really not adept to read letters and decide ourselves. And I don't want you reading the letter, okay? So what we need to do is to help the buyers to understand we are not going to be party to giving a letter that they would want to give to the seller. We cannot do that. We've decided not to do that. And right here is what tells us why. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out to you in this particular document, again, is dual agency. Remember, I said a while ago that I want you to make sure that you have the buyer agency agreement, and you want to make sure that in the buyer agency agreement, you have it marked whether or not you can be a dual agent. This is the really full explanation of dual agency. That's not what you want to do with work with real estate agents, but this is, you want to have a real good understanding of what is written about dual agency. But what you want to get initial is this pattern right here, okay? In that pattern, it says initial only one under authorization. The first one would be allowing the firm to be a dual agent. This is not for you as an individual agent. This is for the firm to be a dual agent. Now, this one is for the firm not to be a dual agent. So if for whatever reason your client thinks that they don't want to allow the firm to be dual agent, they would check this here, these boxes. But you want to help them to understand that that's not really in their best favor. Because we have a lot of listings. Right now we don't because nobody does. But typically we run 400-500 listings. Right now it's probably a little over 100. But typically the firm has that many. So it could cause a buyer to not be knocked out of a house if they do not want to see or make an offer on a Valentine listing. And if they check here, that's what they're checking. They don't understand that sometimes. They think they just want you to take care of them. They're not thinking firm. So in the way you take care of them is the firm is the dual agent, and they come down here and initial right here under designated. Under the designated option, you as an individual agent take care of them individually and nobody else. The firm might have another agent that would take care of the other party. All right, let's scoot on now. That's the really important thing that we need to establish. Okay, I'm going to go, and I want to pull this out one more time. Wire fraud warning. The wire fraud warning is in your buyer's agency it's in the listing agency agreement, and it's also in the offer to purchase. You think it's important? Wire fraud is still an issue in our country. Every day. In fact, I talked to the attorney early this week. He's trying a case right now, trying to defend an agent who did not comply with the rules and the suggestions of verbal that's listed in here. And he said it is really going to be tough to defend him because he violated the warnings that are in your agency agreement. So it wasn't the buyer and the seller, it was the agent himself. So I told him, I said, okay, I've got some classes coming up. I'm going to warn my little agents. You make sure that you do things. This is the one thing that I want to tell y'all to do verbally. Okay. Everything else has to be in writing and everything else should be on a form. But when you get the information on tracking, not tracking, the wire transit number, that's what I'm trying to find. When you get that, that should be verbal from somebody you know. And don't you put it in an email, or don't you forward an email that is encrypted to you, because an encrypted email to you, when you send it, forward it out, it loses its encryptions. Okay. So just be real cautious. And my advice is you stay out of the middle of it. Let the buyer and the seller work with the attorney directly and their bank directly, and you kind of back away from it. Okay. All right. Now let's go on down to the next form. This is your offer to purchase. Again, I'm not going to go through that because I want to show some of these other the other forms, but I did want to have it in our stack of forms. Okay. That we might want to look at today. So let me go on down here just a few minutes, and I want to show you a couple of addenda. See, there's that wire fraud warning in the offer to purchase. Okay. One of the things that I want you as a buyer's agent or a listing agent is this buyer agency discovery form. I am pleased to say you all are being really, really good to get this form in, and it has cut down, I promise you. We had 5 legal cases going on and within a 6-month period of time. And so this little form is, I know it seems cumbersome to you, but I appreciate the fact that you are doing it. And I believe it has saved some of you some money. You just don't know it. This discovery form, we've had to add the section of water in addition to the septic sewer, because we had a lawsuit about 3 months ago that where someone wanted a well. They didn't want to be on city county, and the seller had it on city county, or she thought, and come to find out it wasn't on either. It was on a community well. So it was quite a nightmare. And we've had this in the past, but it hasn't gotten to the lawsuit stage until this last year, about 3 months ago. So I did go ahead and add water. When you call, or your client calls to set up their water sewer service, what they call the utilities, it takes one telephone call for both of those services, because those services are billed on one invoice. So if you're doing your agent discovery, if you make that one telephone call to the water department, your question is their service been provided by the city county to this address for water and for sewer? If they give you yes, then you're done. You're done with that little form. You come put the information on there who you talk to at the county, and then come down here and sign it. You are the buyer's agent. You're going to sign right here. And this little note, if the buyer is your client, you want to give this to the buyer to sign. Again, if they don't want to sign it, they don't have to. The main thing is I want you to present it to them that you did confirm or verify it. And if you do find out that there is a discrepancy somehow on the fact that the seller has said it's on city county, but it's not, it's on a septic, then you have this extra step that you have to take. If there is a private septic tank per the seller, or you find out from the city that it's not in city county, then your next call would be right here, the Environmental Health Services Department in the county where the property is located. You don't just call the water department for this. You'll have to go to the Environmental Health Services Department. In South Carolina, you go to DHEC, okay? But in North Carolina, the counties have Environmental Health Services Departments. So now the goal is for you to find out if there is a permit, if the term permit was issued longer than 6 years ago, they probably are not going to have it on file. If they don't have it on file, you want to make a note that it was not available. See right here, it was not available. Then in the listing, if you're a listing agent, you should note that there is not a permit available. Yes, I want you as buyer's agent and or listing agent to be able to check this out. Don't rely on the listing agent to do it. Many agents don't, but we know it's best practice to do so. So you want to find out if the permit is on the property. Okay, the reason you need to find out if there is a permit is you want to make sure that the septic is of this capacity to handle the number of bedrooms that were advertised in MLS. If they advertise a 5-bedroom house in MLS, you need to have a septic system that's going to service 5 bedrooms. And this is where we're finding a lot of problems where they're advertising 5 bedrooms and it's a 3-bedroom system, because the builders anticipated that they would use probably a couple of those bedrooms for flex rooms, maybe an office or maybe a workout room or something different than a bedroom. Okay. So they built these houses that were much larger on septic systems that won't accommodate that many. But if you're working with a buyer, you need to know that, because the buyer might say, well, there's only 2 of us. We don't need all 5 bedrooms, except when the kids come for Christmas. But when they start trying to sell it, they might need to know that they do have a system that services 5 bedrooms. All right, that's enough on that form. Now, the due diligence request. This is something we haven't talked about much on our Thursday afternoon calls. Due diligence request is the name of what we would call a repair request. After you have had your inspections done on a property, you get an inspection summary and an inspection report. Some of these reports will be in this, maybe 78 pages long or 100 pages long. It's like, oh my gosh, how could they find that many things to inspect? And sometimes inspections last 6 to 8 hours too on those bigger McMansions. But on a typical home right now, you're seeing anywhere from 70 to 80, 90 pages, and they have a summary at the beginning of the reports. Most of them do. That summary is what you're going to pay particular attention to. You are the buyer's agent. You're going to discuss with the buyer the items that particular in that summary. You want to advise that if they have any questions, they can talk to a GC, and always should talk to a professional in the particular area of concern. And that's what their summary and that's what the report will advise as well. But they're going to look to you right at first. They're going to want to know, well, what do you think? What do you think is important on this? Obviously, the inspector thought there was 23 items that were important. You want to pull those 23 items down to a more narrow list if you can. Sometimes the buyer says, nope, I want everything fixed. Again, right now, you're probably not seeing everything fixed. But if the buyer does want everything fixed, or if, let's say, they can narrow it down to 15 things. Some of us try to get it down to 5, and we try to help the buyer to understand anything that's cosmetic is probably not going to be repaired, or general home maintenance is probably not going to be maintained or repaired. So you want to go for the big ticket items first, if your client is so inclined. And I say that lovingly because some people want everything done. Other people say, okay, I can be reasonable. I can fix some of these things myself, or I'm not concerned about certain things. So you're going to narrow it down to the degree you can. As you can see on this due diligence request and agreement, there's not a lot of space to write anything. Look at there. There's not a lot of space to write. So, okay, now how am I going to put 15 things on there? All right. One of the things that you'll see is people will write the number that's identifying the problem. Let's say it's section 1, item 3A or 3D. Don't just do that. Don't put 1A, D in parentheses. That is so lazy. Take a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper, and itemize by the number, by the heading, and the item as to what the buyer wants done. If you will do that and put yourself a list there, when you present it to the seller is so much more comfortable to be able to look at each one of those items, the things that they will fix, they can mark through if they don't want to fix it, the things they do fix, they'll leave it alone. And when you get that form back, which would be an additional page to this particular form, you can easily see what the seller's not going to do. If you just put a number and another number by common, if you do that, it's just not going to, it's not efficient. So if you will itemize those items on a separate piece of paper, and on this, you're going to put C attached, okay? And then when you get to an agreement, if the seller sends some things back that they're not going to fix, if your buyer accepts the fact that they're not going to fix them, they initial beside where the seller has marked through. Remember, you always need both parties, all parties, in agreement when there's a change on whether it's a contract or this due diligence page. You're going to need all signatories again on that. Now, sometimes people will come to the understanding that maybe the buyer said, well, I want to use my own repair people. I don't want the seller to fix it before closing. I will get my own people and I'll do it after closing. Or they say, well, we don't have time to get the repairs that I want done or whatever. So they come to an agreement that they will, instead of having repairs done, they will settle on an amount. And it's not a bad idea as a buyer's agent. I know the listing agents do it all the time, but it's not a bad idea for a buyer agent to call SpecWo or one of the companies that will do an estimate from the inspection report, and they can estimate as to the cost involved in these repairs. That way you have a pretty good understanding when you start trying to negotiate an amount of money. A lot of people will have a GC go out and take the inspection report and give estimates. Some GCs charge, the contracting companies charge, others don't, because they're going with the prospect that they might have a job out of it. It all depends on who you use. If they go out and they give an estimate, at least, and sometimes you have to get 2 estimates to be able to justify an amount. Yesterday, one of the agents was talking about HVAC. The seller had advertised that he had a new gas pack, and he didn't have a new gas pack at all. There wasn't even a gas pack on the property. Somehow he got confused. And so as it turned out, it was going to be like a $12,700 problem to put the new system in. And the seller then agreed that he would give $5,000 toward that 12,700. Okay. So in that situation, you would come back over here to this due diligence request, and you're going to write a note right in here that the buyer and the seller have agree. The seller will provide $5,000 for buyers at closing, for buyer's closing cost, or to buyer at closing. And right here, I basically put agrees to give $6,500 to buyer at closing, just to remind myself to tell you that. If you are going to settle it with an amount of money, you can either have all the items listed here, and then what you want is the phrase "in lieu of all repairs, seller agrees to pay buyer $6,500 at closing." And you want the phrase "in lieu of," because you've given them this list, remember, and you've got some things struck through that they're not wanting to do. And now you have come to the place that you are agreeing to take an amount of money. So you want that piece of paper as a paper trail. You want on here that in lieu of those repairs, that the buyer and seller now agree on that amount. You're going to come down here and have that signed by the buyer and the seller. That's the agreement between the buyer and seller that does not, listen to me, it does not go to the attorney, and it does not go to the lender. This is an agreement between the buyer and the seller, and the way you want it notated along with your contract to the lender and to the attorney, you use the form agreement to amend. And it should be our next form here. This is the most wonderful little form. There are so many things on here. All you have to do is just check, and you don't have to play like an attorney and try to write things you're not supposed to do. On here, you can change the contract, amend the contract by these different ways if needed. Sometimes you might want to reduce the purchase price by that $6,500. Most lenders don't want you to do that, and most sellers don't. You're in the process, the loan is in process, and they don't want changes on that. So it's very seldom you change the purchase price if there is an amount settled in lieu of. Sometimes if it's a cash transaction, it makes sense to reduce the purchase price, because there's no sense in the buyer just having to bring the money and get it right back. Okay. So if it's a cash transaction, you might want to reduce the purchase price, but with a loan, you rarely do. And just as a sidebar, while we're looking at this form, these are some other things that you might run into other than your due diligence. Every now and then, let's look at this where it says due diligence fee and due diligence period. Every now and then you can't get the contractor out there, and you cannot get the estimate that you need to be able to support the amount of money that you're going to negotiate. So you might have to extend the due diligence period. If you need to extend the due diligence period, again, you can ask, but the seller is under no obligation to agree. If you want to ask for that extra period, this is where you would do it here. And this would amend that date that's back in your offer to purchase, but you originally agreed that 5 p.m. on that date, you would have it settled. And by the way, before that 5 p.m. date on the end date of the due diligence period, you do not have to have repairs done. You have to have agreement as to them being done, what's going to be done, or what amount of money is going to be shared in lieu of the repairs. Okay. Now, having said that, every now and then you will run into a seller that says, I will give you an extra week if you increase your due diligence by $700 or whatever the amount is. You don't hear it quite as much, but every now and then you will get a seller who says, I don't have to extend, I don't want to extend, but if you want it extended, you're going to pay me to do so. If that's the case, then this is the form that you would use here. All right. Now come down here. Here is your settlement date. The settlement date is the date that's in the contract. Remember, we have 7 days beyond the contract to settle. What if one or the parties, if it was not possible for one of the parties to close? Not being possible generally means there was a lien, a problem, there was a title problem, there was a loan problem for the buyer. So they have those extra little grace period to resolve those things that made the closing not possible to happen. It does not mean that, oh, the seller had this vacation plan. Oh dear. So now we need these extra 7 days for the seller to get back off vacation. That should have been discussed and been determined at the time of contract. It does not allow the seller to have his vacation or the buyer or whatever. So it has to do with those, generally a third party that's causing something not to be possible to close. So, and if for whatever reason you need to go beyond those 7 days, this is where you would note that you need to go beyond 7 days. And if you want to only go 4 days instead of an additional 7 days, you're going to check right here. Again, this is one of those times that a seller may require additional funds in order to go past that 7 days that's already in the contract. And if they do, you're going to come up here and look in this little section right here about, generally it's earnest money. The buyer prefers this to be earnest money because there's a possibility they could get it back. The buyer would prefer not to do additional due diligence money, because that means they have to come out of pocket right now. The seller, on the other hand, is going to want more due diligence fee and may consider additional earnest money. So you're going to have to negotiate that too if you need extra days beyond the 7 days here. Now, as we were talking, when I got into explaining this form, this is where you want to go back to this form. And in your offer to purchase, if the seller has not agreed to give any closing costs, any settlement cost expenses to the buyer in that contract, that's going to be a 0 right here. But now, because we've got the in lieu of repairs due diligence agreement, we're going to put $6,500. Okay. If there are closing expenses in the offer to purchase, let's say the seller had agreed to $3,500, then you would put $3,500 here, and then that $3,500 would be plus $6,500. So the total amount was $10,000. So if there is an amount here, it's to be added to whatever amount you're pulling in off that in lieu of due diligence report. So you possibly would have 10,000 here. Be real cautious of this right here. I might as well go ahead and explain this to you. Every now and then, if there are closing costs in the offer to purchase, such as I just mentioned $3,500, and then you want to come in with an amount in lieu of on repairs. In this illustration, we basically came up to 10,000. You might be okay on 10,000, but the lenders have a maximum amount that that a seller can give to the buyer. And so you need to work with the lender and make sure that you haven't exceeded that amount. If the lender said, no, the buyer cannot receive 10,000 from the seller because that exceeds the limit, whatever the underwriting guideline is, often it's not any more than 3%, but there are some other qualifiers. But just be cautious if you already have closing costs in the contract. You need to work with the lender on how much additional amount you can put in there. The other thing to take in consideration on that is If you say you want $10,000 to go from the seller to the buyer and it's to go to closing costs, and the closing costs are not $10,000 and they rarely ever are, guess what? The money goes back to the seller. The buyer doesn't get the money. The seller can't just give cash to the buyer, okay? Even on the contract, and any monies that are expended, it has to be reflected on the CD or the HUD. So I'm just cautioning you, if this amount gets too excessive, you need to work with the lender. And this is the form that goes to the lender, not the due diligence agreement. I've just dumped a whole bunch on you on this, haven't we? But this is something you'll be working on. Sometimes we think we get all excited when we get a contract signed and we think, oh, it's under contract. We're so excited. And it's like, oh, but you're not anywhere near getting this really under contract till you get through the due diligence period and get all that worked out. Okay. So your agreement to amend goes to the lender and it goes to the attorney. Let's see, I think I got one more over here. Now, let's talk about another aspect. When we worked on that due diligence agreement, remember the due diligence agreement? We had the seller, we presented the offer, the due diligence request to the seller. The seller came back and said, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that, I'm not doing 4 or 5 things on there. And the buyer said, well, I'm not buying the house, because I want, those are deal breakers for me. I'm not buying the house. And the seller said, well, I'm not spending any more money. And I think you all have run into that in this market because the sellers are so in control. They may have gotten $27,000 or $30,000 over asking price, but they are so in charge. And they said, I'm not fixing anything, or I may fix 1 or 2, but I'm not fixing anything. And you're thinking, but the buyer just gave you a contract for $27,000 over asking price, and you can't even fix a stopper in the sink. No, I'm not gonna fix anything. So the buyer has a real tough decision to make. Does he go back in the market and try to find a house, or does he does he terminate this and go back in the market? Or does he suck it up and say, okay, I'm going to pay $20,000, $27,000 more than asking price, and I guess I'll hire the repair person too. And we're seeing that happen, which is what is allowing these sellers to have such power right now. But if your buyer says, I'm not buying this house, then this is the form that you need to use. You use the due diligence request first, okay? And if for whatever reason you cannot come to an agreement, which you would put on the agreement to amend form, if the seller and the buyer cannot agree, then you need to send this form to the seller. This form, prior to this last summer, was called notice to the seller that the buyer is exercising their right to terminate, because in the offer to purchase, the buyer is given the right to terminate prior to 5 p.m. on the end date of the due diligence period. Remember, we've talked about that already. That's a time is the essence date. They have a right to terminate up to 5 p.m. on the end date of due diligence period. They do not have a right to get the due diligence fee back. The due diligence fee is what they paid for the right to terminate. That's all that due diligence fee is for. It's paying for the right to terminate. So prior to 5 p.m. on the end date, if the buyer is not going to move forward, you as the agent need to be aware of this form, which is now called termination of contract by notice to the seller from the buyer. And if you'll notice this little section here, this is where it talks about it's a unilateral right to terminate per the contract. If the buyer wants the contract stopped right now, not go any further, when this form goes to the listing agent, the contract is terminated. every now and then, there's a little smart ploy that investors taught some of our agents in the last 2 or 3 years. Sometimes they want to bluff a seller, and they will say to the seller, well, here is my repair request, and here is my termination. If you don't want to agree to my request, then consider the contract terminated. Doesn't work. They sent this, and this terminates the contract. So we have had to re-educate our agents not to play the games of the investments little ploy. When you send a due diligence request, do not send a termination request or notice, because you then have terminated the contract. So, and it's unilateral. It does not take the signature of the seller. It doesn't take the agreement of the seller. This is the buyer's right that they bought with the due diligence fee. Now, having said that, if the reason they're terminating would be this right here, exercise by buyer of right to terminate during the due diligence period, see paragraph 4G of the contract. That's what I've been reiterating to you a little bit here. If that's the reason they're terminating, all you have to do is check this box right here, bring it down here and get the signature. And once you send that over to the listing agent, that contract is terminated. Okay. Now, again, this has to be done before 5 p.m. It's either the agreement on the repairs or the termination. If neither of those have been conveyed to the other party, then at 5 p.m., the buyer has forfeited his right to terminate, and the buyer then is going to proceed to closing. And after 5 p.m., the buyer and the seller share the risk of whether or not it's going to close. Up until the time of due diligence end date, it is all risk on the seller side, because the seller has but one way that they can terminate, and it has to do with the earnest money and the due diligence not being delivered. So it's all the buyer's favor. Now, let's look at page 2 of this particular document. This one is a little different from some of the other termination notices. And you'll notice this right here. The seller acknowledges that the buyer is entitled to a refund. The word acknowledges is key. He doesn't agree. He probably doesn't want the buyer to terminate, but he acknowledges that in the contract, he has already agreed that the earnest money goes back to the buyer if the buyer terminates before 5 p.m. on the end date of the due diligence period. So he's acknowledging that. I've got to tell you, this has an awful lot to do with the agent. If the agent has prepared the seller of the term in the contract, then the seller almost always acknowledges it, and you don't have that much trouble. Every now and then, an agent hasn't done their job as a listing agent, and the seller thinks this is an agreement. And the seller said, I'm not going to give them the earnest money back. They kept my house off the market 2 days, however many days. And if that's the case, I'll explain to you if you get in that situation. I'm not going to go into it right now, but you've gone into a dispute on earnest money. But there's no reason to go into dispute on earnest money with this form, because it is it's spelled out. It's clear right there in the offer of purchase. So you might want to make sure that you help the other agent to understand this acknowledgement. Now, if that is the case, you can give this, if they sign it, then you can give this to the attorney that's holding the earnest money. The money is going to be released to the buyer per this agreement. If the seller does not sign this, the escrow agent, the attorney, is not going to release it. They will not release it until they have the signatures of both parties. So that's why I say it's really important to educate and inform those sellers what they have signed already in the offer to purchase. And this is just substantiating what they've already signed and they're acknowledging it. So you have, in working through the due diligence, you have your inspection. You might have several inspections. You might have your general inspection and your termite inspection, which every house should have that. And the inspector is going to possibly say you might need to have an HVAC tech to come out, or a roofer, licensed roofer, or a structural engineer. You, as working with a buyer, you are responsible to help them to understand the necessity of having these inspections. It's their right whether or not they're going to get those inspections. If they are going to get those inspections, we have a form called professional services disclosure and election. And that's the form that you're going to use with the buyer to find out which inspections they're going to want to have, which ones they're going to waive. And you're going to use that as a little worksheet so that if they want you to order a structural engineer, then you have it in writing on that professional services disclosure that they've asked you to do it. All right. Don't just order a structural engineer because you think it's necessary per the inspection report. If the buyer doesn't agree in writing for you to order it, they don't have to pay for it. And you might have to pay for it, as one of my little agents did 2 or 3 months ago. He thought he was doing the right thing to service and take care of the client. The client decided not to buy the house, and the client decided that he didn't want that structural engineer report because he didn't ask for it. And of course, the structural engineer wanted to be paid, and the person who ordered it was the agent. So that's another reason why you want to have that professional services disclosure form. And like I said, that's an organic form. You might start day one, but you'll probably be working on it toward closing too. Okay. So let's see. I believe those are all the forms in this particular stack. Now let me go show you the other forms I wanted for us to look at. Or I guess I should stop long enough to ask you if you have a question. I'm sorry. You know, you can always ask a question and raise your hand. I might not even see it, but don't put it in chat because I definitely won't see the chat. But you're free to at any time to ask a question. Okay. Now let's look at some of these other addenda that you might use with your offer to purchase. I think this is such a good little form. It's the additional signatures addendum. Every now and then you might be either purchasing an estate, or if you're a listing agent, it might be listing an estate. That's primarily when you need this additional signatures, because sometimes there could be 15 or 18 or every many parties involved. If there's an estate and there's 4 or 5 heirs, and if either of those 4 or 5 heirs are married, they could easily have 9 or 10. So our forms allow 2 places for signatures. So you've got to have some place to add all those other signatures. And for years, we could go in and put a little initial box or put additional signatures in the margins of the offer to purchase. But the form writers did release this little form for us. And so it's very handy if you're working on an estate. You probably are not going to need it otherwise, maybe a trust, but most of the time it would be with an estate. But it's all it is allowing you to have a form to put all these extra signatures on. But let me tell you the nicest thing about this little form. I like the usefulness of it, but looky here. Look at this right here. The additional signatures addendum is attached to and made part of the following named documents, including any addenda listed here. Looky here. You don't have to get this form every time you get one of the other forms signed. You can get this one form signed as long as you list the ones that the others are going, that are going to be signed by the other 2, such as you're working with real estate agents. It could be your buyer agency agreement. It could be the offer to purchase. I really prefer you have an extra addendum on the offer to purchase. I just feel like all the heirs need to be informed on that. But it could be the residential property disclosure. It could be the MOG, you know, so you can use this form with multiple other forms without having to repeat the addendum with each one. Okay, so I just think that's a neat feature of that particular form. Now let's look at the other form, the next form that's called additional provisions addendum. We do not use this expiration of offer very much. And the reason it is right now, sellers aren't paying attention to it, but even in a balanced market, look at what it says. This offer shall expire unless unconditional acceptance is delivered to the buyer. That means there should be a contract. In other words, the buyer presented the offer. If the seller signed the offer and gave it back to the buyer's agent, that's unconditional acceptance and delivered back to the buyer. And very few times is a seller going to say, yes, I like this offer, here, sign it, and get it right back to the buyer. So they sellers disregard it. And once it's disregarded, it goes away, because this is to protect the buyer's right. If the buyer wants to walk by that particular time and maybe go on to another house, which in the balanced market sometimes happens, then it can be used. But notice that is a time as the essence date, and it's only protect the buyer's right to walk away from that offer if the seller hasn't signed the offer. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that because that's irrelevant to most contracts. The rental income and investment property. I'm seeing a lot of this. Are you? Where there's a tenant occupied? And I guess we're going to be seeing more because we've got so many investment buyers in town that are going to be putting tenants in there. And when they start trying to sell, in fact, did you see that article in Inman the other day where they said Zillow is about ready to unload a lot of the investment properties? And I'm going, oh, great. It's going to be fun to see what they're going to do out there and unloading their properties that they bought as an iBuyer. But anyway, if there is a tenant in the property, you want to use this additional provisions addendum, and you want to make sure that you have a date in here where it says seller shall deliver to the buyer only before whatever date that is, true and complete copies of all existing leases, rental agreements, outstanding tenant notices, written statements of all oral tenant agreements, statements of all tenant deposits, their security deposits, uncured defaults by the seller or tenants, and claims made by or to a tenants, if any. That's a mouthful. That's a lot of stuff. But if there are leases, or if there is a lease on a single property, you want to make sure that you see that lease and make sure, don't let this go away. You want a statement of the tenant's deposit, but don't let your buyer close until they have a security deposit certified check. All right. I've got one going on right now. I cannot believe this. 5 weeks after closing, and the seller hasn't given the security deposit to the buyer. Now, when that the tenant wants to vacate the property, where is the buyer going to get the security deposit to pay whatever portion back to the tenant? And heaven forbid if the tenant destroys the house, is he just going to go fix it? So that buyer's agent did not take care of that client. If there is a tenant, there's got to be a security deposit, or you're going to have a record that there wasn't. So this is a business transaction. This is not well, I guess buying and selling houses are all a business transaction, but this is a business transaction. So take care of the details. Don't let a buyer go in there and buy a property with a tenant in it without having the paperwork and the things behind it. Sometimes you have to go through the property manager too, okay? Now, right here, you notice it says any security deposit held in connection with any lease shall be transferred to the buyer. That's what I was just talking about, and it needs to be done at settlement. It is not done on the settlement statement. It's typically it's a third party setting. And right here it says seller will or will not transfer to buyer any pet fee. you know, a lot of landlords do have like a 250 or 350 pet fee, and there's a pet fee addendum in our library of forms. Make sure that you take note of this. The security deposit is one thing, but the pet deposit is a separate fee. All right, so make sure you take a note of that. Now, this next number four is what we see more often than, well, we see that a lot, but this one right here, if the buyer, when the buyer walks through the house and they see something they want repaired, right then, they want it repaired. They don't want to wait and see what the inspector says. They know without a shadow of a doubt, they want that scratch in the kitchen, the hardwood floors that the big Great Dane had left from the previous owner. They want that fixed. They want those hardwood floors refinished. All right. If the buyer says, along with this offer, I want that done, this is where you put it. You're going to make note of any item that needs to be repaired, replaced, whatever that the buyer wants at the time of making the offer. It's something the buyer sees at that time. This is where you would put it. Otherwise, you have the inspections, and then you have your due diligence repair request, and you put those items on there. This would be only for the things that are visible to the buyer. If the buyer doesn't care, if they wait until the inspector's report and put those items on there, they can. Do not use this form after the inspection. After the inspection's done, you do not come back and use this form as items to be repaired. You will use only the due diligence request and agreement after the inspections are done. Okay. Now let's scooch on down here. I don't know why people do it, but we see that more frequently than we should. Now, page 2 of that additional provisions. Look at this right here. We have a lot of houses that have pools in our area, right? Particularly if they're owned by a relocation company or one of these iBuyer programs, they winterize pools. And they typically winterize pools between October and March. And if your buyer wants to buy a home in December, but you know they want to have a pool inspection, if there's a pool there, you're going to recommend a pool inspection, right? So this should be used with any offer that you make or your buyer makes on a home that has a pool, because you're going to specify right here who is going to be responsible for re-winterizing. It costs to winterize a pool. If the pool is winterized and the buyer wants to have the inspection, the owner would have to remove the winterization. The buyer is going to have his own inspection, but the buyer most often says, not my problem, it's not my list. And if they want it winterized, they could re-winterize it. And the seller said, we had it winterized and we took it away because you wanted the pool inspection. So you're going to pay for re-winterizing. So go ahead and put this with your offer in the first place. And I know what you're going to do. You're going to put that the seller is going to pay for the re-winterizing, right? Because you're writing it for the buyer. So you go ahead and get that checked. And it would be up to the seller, the listing agent, to change that if they don't agree. And of course, you'd have to negotiate that. But just know that this is there for the pool winterization or re-winterization. Now, the backup contract. You know how much I like backup contracts. I like open houses and backup contracts. Okay. Backup contracts, particularly in this market, I think are very beneficial to the buyer. I think it's good for the seller, but primarily for the buyer. If the buyer finally finds the house in the neighborhood, the location they're wanting, and they finally find that house is just ideal for them. Instead of hitting the trail again and trying to find another one, at least put in a backup contract on this one that they really know is it, but there is already a contract on it. This is like a first right of refusal. If they put the backup contract, it does not limit their right to go and look at other houses. It doesn't limit their right to terminate this one if they find another house they like better. There's no downside to the buyer. The only thing that the buyer sometimes says, well, what do you mean I have to put earnest money down on this property? Now that's what I mean, because it says so right here in the backup addendum that there would be, where is it now? I was going to show you the earnest money. Earnest money, you would put, you don't put due diligence fee, okay? But you would put earnest money, which means the earnest money would be held by the attorney. It didn't go into the seller's hands. It is with the attorney, the escrow agent. And the due diligence fee is not paid until 2 days after the buyer is notified that they're in primary position. So from the time you put in this backup contract, you're going to put some earnest money with the attorney. The buyer can continue to look at other properties. The buyer can wait to see if they do get notified that they're in primary position. But until they're notified, and let me show you how they'll be notified. It's page 3 of the addendum. There it is. If that other one falls through, and I'm seeing a number of contracts fall through right now, the primary position, for various reasons. Sometimes it's inspections, sometimes it's buyer's remorse. But if it does fall through, then the listing agent will send this form to your buyer. And once your buyer gets this notice, then their right to go shopping and find another house is over. Their earnest money is obviously attached to this house. And then that's when, go back up here at the top of page 2, that's when the buyer would need to put their due diligence fee in the hands of the seller within 2 days of receiving that notice. The due diligence fee is paid. And remember, in the offer to purchase, you've already noted how much due diligence fee is due, all right? And you now when you fill out that offer to purchase, if it is a backup contract, there are 2 blanks. One is for the due diligence end date, the end date of the due diligence period, and the other is the settlement date. In those 2 blanks, put see attached addendum. Don't put a date in there because you don't know what the date's going to be, because you're waiting on to find out if they get a notice from the primary, the contract's falling through. So in those 2 blanks, you would put see attached. You can put a see attached backup addendum or just addendum. And this tells you right here what's going to happen on the due diligence period. The due diligence period of the contract shall extend through 5 p.m. on the last day of a 15-day period or 21-day period. Whatever you would have put in the offer to purchase as the end date. Most of us use 21 days. So in this situation, you put a 21-day period. You don't have to put a date because you don't know what the date is again, because they're in backup position. Same thing with settlement. It's not unusual that you would have a 30-day closing. So if 30 days past the notice of being in primary position, it's going to go in this blank right here. So can you see how beneficial it is to the buyer? Yeah, they put some earnest money in escrow, but do you know they get that earnest money back if they haven't been notified? They don't even have to get agreement. They just go, we can basically send over that 350 form. Remember I showed you a while ago, the 350 had lots of different ways that you terminate the contract. They check the box on there about backup, the backup addendum. and that being notified and being primary position, they give that to the attorney and they get their money. That's the only time that we don't even require the seller to sign it, because the form writers gave that flexibility to the buyer. So I just think this is the best little addendum ever. Right here, notice this, it says automatic termination. In any event, the buyer must receive notice of primary position from the seller no later than 5 p.m. on a certain day. If the buyer does want to give a period of time, like a 2-week period of time, so that he has no obligation to this contract beyond that, he can put a period of time in there. Sometimes the agents don't put a time limit in there because they may not know when the due diligence period is going to end on that other contract. And again, that's just an option for the buyer and the buyer's agent. But it's a good little form, a good option for a lot of people.
Saber, I have a question
Sure.
about this. What if you've got a backup contract in place, you're representing the seller, and the primary buyer that you're under contract with, they discover something, it's material that causes them to terminate the contract. So they send you notice of termination and tell you the problem. And then you turn around and provide the notice to the backup to trigger that, and at the same time disclose the information you just learned to them. Is the buyer locked in and loses the diligence fee, even though there's new information that's come to light?
Wouldn't lose the due diligence because he hadn't paid it.
Oh, okay, all right. What about, when does that diligence fee become payable?
2 days after their notice they're in primary.
Okay, so they've got 2 days to terminate if they want, based on the new information that may have come to light. And so the listing agent really has a duty to disclose that information before those 2 days run.
If the information is material fact.
Yes.
If it's material fact, it's not that that an inspector visually said there's an issue. They
Right,
need to have verified that as a material fact. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Good. Thanks. That's a good point to clarify. Good job. Okay. Now let's see. The FHA VA financing addendum. If your buyer is going to go FHA or VA, you might as well put this addendum with the offer to purchase right up front, because if you don't, the lender's going to do it and they're going to have to send it back through to get it done. You can't have an FHA loan without, or VA without having this addendum. Either you provide it or the lender provides it. Now, it's the same wording, different formats in different states. When you see the FHA VA financing addendum in South Carolina, you say, well, it looks different. It's just the way they formatted it in South Carolina. But the wording and the intent is still the same. The basic thing right here is this little section right here. The buyer who is getting FHA or VA loan is protected by this addendum. If the property does not appraise for the sales price in the offer to purchase. If the sales price is $325,000, the appraised value must match $325,000. Or the buyer has a right to terminate the contract, walk away, and get a refund of earnest money, not DDF. It's a return of earnest money. This addendum supersedes a due diligence end date. Now, you know that the goal is to try to make sure the buyer has confidence that they're going to get the loan by the end date of due diligence period, right? And often you don't get that confidence or confirmation, but that's the goal. However, with an FHA or VA addendum that goes past that date. So right up to the day of closing, if the buyer can't close because the house didn't appraise and they don't have the extra cash that they can put in to make the difference, they, right up to the day of closing, can terminate the contract based upon this addendum. Which is, I mean, really so helpful and so beneficial to people who are getting the FHA VA mortgage. But the sad thing of it is for the seller. The seller should not have to wait till the day before closing. And most of the time you're going to know earlier. But what's happening right now, I think it's some unethical stuff that's going on because there's so many multiple offers and buyers are trying to find a way to get accepted, get their offer accepted. They are not indicating that they're getting an FHA or VA. Most of it's FHA. They're not getting the FHA loan. Therefore, there's no FHA addendum. So the seller says, okay, this is better. I don't have to worry about an FHA appraisal that might come in low that would stick with my house. I don't have to worry about the appraisal addendum that they might could walk away for that reason. So I really like this. I like this offer. I like the terms. Everything is good. So the seller accepts the offer. And then a few days later, maybe 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever, the lender comes back and says, you know, Mr. Buyer, you could get a better rate, or I think it would be better for you to go FHA. And of course, the buyer wants a better rate. And of course, the buyer wants to put less money down. And the buyer then chooses to go FHA. What are you going to do as a buyer's agent? Are you going to let them change loan types, which could possibly even change the date they close? But it definitely is going to affect the seller if there's an FHA appraisal and an FHA addendum. You better be telling the seller's agent as soon as you know that the buyer needs to change. And they're going to accuse you of writing an offer falsely and not identifying that the buyer needs to go FHA, not conventional, even though it could have been very innocent. And there are times, and I've seen this, there are times that it's very innocent, that they start out conventional and the lender does say you need to do it FHA. But we're also seeing some unethical scenarios where it was a ploy to get their offer accepted. So please don't be involved in that. All right. You got to play nice out there. But the other thing is, if that happens, do not wait until 2 days before closing to get the FHA addendum signed. Sometimes the lender will say, well, I don't need it until such and such a date. I'm telling you, you need to tell that listing agent early on, you need to get that addendum signed and having your buyer taken care of, and just go ahead and face it right up front. What is that book, Eat the Frog the First Thing in the Morning? Don't delay, because it looks very suspicious if you do, and it causes a very difficult closing in sometimes. So if you'll just be upfront and disclose it if they do have to change. Like I said, the main thing of it is that it doesn't appraise, the buyer doesn't have to buy the house. Okay, let's scoot on down here. An owner's association disclosure. The residential property and owners association disclosure is one document that has actually two purposes, okay? It's the residential property disclosure and the owner association disclosure all in one document. And if you remember, there are some exemptions for the residential property disclosure. Those 4 exemptions are for a foreclosure, an estate, new construction never lived in, and a family member that's living in the home that you transfer ownership to. The foreclosure you can understand, and the estate you can understand. The new construction, never lived in. Remember, when someone tells you never lived in the home, it has to be new construction, never lived in. It's not an investor who owns a house who's never lived in it, okay? It's only new construction, never lived in. The MOG, your mineral and oil and gas mandatory disclosure, has the same exemptions with the exception of the new construction. New construction sales do require the MOG. Now, this form that I'm showing you here, if perchance, let's say the house in Providence Country Club went into foreclosure. So therefore, they don't have to have a residential property and owners association disclosure, right? Because it's a foreclosure. But I guarantee you there is an owner association in Providence Country Club. So this form, the owners association, is that portion split out into a separate form. If they are exempt from the residential disclosure, they're not exempt from the owners disclosure, owners association disclosure. So you would use this form. If it's not too confusing, if you want to use the other form and just mark through the first 2 or 3 pages, it serves the same purpose, because again, they just split that form out, and that's what this is. But know if there is an owners association, you're going to have a disclosure, one of the other forms, whichever, and this is the form that would be most used. You don't see this all too often. And by the way, if you're selling land, land does not require the residential property disclosure or the MOG. If the land is in a development where there is an owners association, you do need that owners association form, okay? So that you can convey the information as to the owners association and what they cover and what they don't cover. Okay. And let's see, there was one other look right here. We do have a short sale addendum. I hope to goodness we don't have to use this anytime soon. I tell you what, back in 2008 and 9 and 10, Lordy mercy, I think about every other sale that we did, maybe it wasn't even that, it might have been even more, was a short sale. And so working on a short sale, the only thing short about it is the fact that the bank doesn't get paid all the money they're due, but it is a long drawn out process. It can take months. I think the longest one that we dealt with was like 13 months for a buyer to hang in there to try to get that house. A short sale addendum is similar to your backup addendum. I'm not going to go into detail because I know you're not doing any right now, and we'll have some more forms classes before we'll get into the scenario if we do get into that market again. And obviously we will spend a lot of time on short sales if we get into that market. Now, there is another form that I wanted to point out to you. This new construction addendum. Most builders have their own forms. So when you take a buyer into a model home, that builder has already had forms developed by an attorney, and of course they're in favor of the builder, but they are pre-printed and pre-populated in many instances. So most builders have their own forms. Every now and then you do have a smaller builder, maybe a custom builder that only builds a few homes a year, and they don't have their own forms. They will often say, well, why don't you just use the 2T offer to purchase? Well, it's probably not expedient to use the 2T, which is your typical offer to purchase on resales. There is a new construction addendum that would be helpful in the scenario where maybe the house hasn't been finished. Maybe they started the house, and they need to, they want to finish certain things. In this particular addendum, this would be for a house that maybe they've already started it, and the foundation's there, the studs are up, but they haven't finished some of the part of it. A builder may sometimes do what we refer to as a spec house, and they may not have actually finished it. Some of the provisions in here, like the additional improvements, you can itemize the things here, of the things that the buyer is going to expect to be finished. This form is, I don't mean to confuse you. I think I said this incorrectly a moment ago. This is the addendum that goes with the 2T if the house has already been started. If the house has not been started, then you would use the new construction addendum, not addendum, the actual offer to purchase. It's called offer to purchase new construction, and it's 800-T. We see this very seldom, but again, I think it's advisable for you to use the new construction 800-T rather than the 2T if the house has not, the construction has not started. Otherwise, if it has, you'd use the addendum. And this just clarifies, you know, if you've been, I don't know how many of you sold new construction already, but boy, when you go to sell new construction, you're going to have 25 or 30 pages of, you're going to have lots of things. And they put their specifications in there. They put the picture of the elevation. They put so many things that's part of the agreement. The buyer has a right to know what it's going to look like, what is going to be a part of that house. And so they itemize all those things. Well, these forms allow those itemizations to be in writing, okay, and agreed upon. So if you are going to be dealing with new construction, know that those forms are available to you. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because you're probably not going to use them that much. Let's go down here a minute. Seller financing. Again, you don't see this very much, but every now and then a seller owns the home free and clear, and they're willing to let a buyer pay them, and they act as the bank. They have a mortgage. The attorneys draft a mortgage between the buyer and the seller. They have an amortization chart that the attorney provides to the buyer. But remember, it has to be free and clear. The seller cannot have a first mortgage on it. If the house is free and clear, then you can do a seller financing. Most often with seller financing, there will be a balloon payment. The seller may allow amortization, let's say for 15 years, which lowers the payment. And at the end of 5 years, or more often 3 years, the seller will expect a payoff, which is called a balloon payment. The balloon payment is going to include all the amounts of the payments past that 3 years up to 15 years. It's been amortized over 15 years. And so there's going to be a higher amount at the end of the 3 years. That's why it's called a balloon payment. If a seller will give the buyer an extended time, that's generally very appealing to a buyer, especially with the interest rates as they are now. Do not expect the seller to give a rate that's comparable to the bank. The seller's rate is going to be higher than you can get at the bank. The reason people get seller financing is because they can't get a loan at the bank a lot of times, okay? So just realize that the seller can get a higher rate. That's a way some people, that's another stream of income from sellers. I had a client down in Florida when I was selling down there. So he and his mother, I think, owned somewhere like 300 or 400 houses. And they would rent the houses, they buy the houses, they rent it for a while. It's kind of like our iBuyer programs, or like Knock does, or Ribbon. They buy for a period of time and let the buyer clear up the credit or whatever they need to do. And then they held the mortgage because the houses were free and clear, and they would hold the mortgage. And they had mortgages for, like I say, between 300 and 400 houses at that time. The mother was doing it up in the Washington area, and he was doing it down in Florida. I thought, wow, that's a pretty good retirement plan right there to have that many. But anyway, this is the addendum you would use. And if you have that scenario, call me and we'll go through the details on this addendum if you have any questions on it, or just ask the closing attorney. Because the closing attorney has to do the mortgage. There's just no lender involved. Now here's just the professional services disclosure. I was talking about this a moment ago. I can't tell you how valuable this little report, this little worksheet is. And I know it's aggravating because again, it's making you pay attention to the details and you just want to go sell another house. But this is the form that you want to go over with your buyer more than once, all right? Initially, you're going to go over it with them for the items on the inspection. You also may want to talk to them about a warranty. Buyers, even though we're in a seller's market and the seller is saying, I'm not paying for a warranty, go ahead and tell the buyer the benefit to them. The warranty, even though it's for 1 year, most buyers do want it, and it is beneficial to them. My daughter was so pleased that I had put a warranty, and obviously I put it on there for her, but a home warranty, because her refrigerator went out during that first year, and there was a problem with an oven too. But anyway, she got 2 new appliances because the repair people weren't able to fix them. They were older appliances when they bought the house, and so she is a proponent and a half of the home warranty, and I was so pleased of the warranty that I had chosen for her that they honored that. Some of the warranties will let a buyer buy them at the realtor rate within 30 days of closing, and they will let them renew up to like 3 years. So if you do get a home warranty on the property, let the buyer know that they can renew it at the end of that year. And that's what my daughter did. And so she kept it on there for about 3 years, and she wishes that she could have kept it in longer, but nevertheless. So talk to them about the warranty. Right here, this attorney, one of the things you want to bring up real early in your discussion with your buyers would be the attorney. Now, when you do the buyer agency agreement with your buyer, remember that was one of those forms way back then? When you do the buyer agency agreement, you are asked to give the buyer 3 forms. One of the forms is questions and answers on inspections, 2 sample forms that has the waterworks sample on it. One of them is the professional services disclosure, and the other is the offer to purchase. Well, obviously it makes sense for the offer to purchase because that's what they're going to be signing. It's good for them to read that. But this professional services disclosure, like I said, it's a watermark sample. But this is where you start talking to them about, so we're going to come back and we're going to have our own worksheet and we're going to go over it in detail. But I want to tell you, Mr. Buyer, one of the first things we need to talk about is the attorney that's going to close. In our offer to purchase in North Carolina, the buyer chooses the attorney, right? So the buyer needs to know an attorney. And furthermore, they need to know an attorney early on because that's where the earnest money is going to go. Remember, our firm and most firms in Charlotte area right now are not holding earnest money anymore. They're not maintaining a trust account. So therefore, the earnest money has to go to an attorney. Well, you got to know what attorney to take the earnest money to. And when you're busy writing an offer, it's like, oh my gosh, I've got to get this offer written because I got to get through these multiple offers and get it accepted. And then it's like, oh, where are we going to put the earnest money? So one of the first things you want to do is talk to them about, on that sample form, let's talk about an attorney. And you can recommend 3. Don't just recommend 1 because that's steering or assumed steering. You can always say your personal experience has been really super with 1 or 2 of those. You can give that type of recommendation. But one of the reasons this year, you see how there's a wide spot over here. Up until this year, it was narrow. Now they've given us enough room for us to itemize 2 or 3 people that we would recommend. Sometimes a buyer will take the time to call all 3 of these. Other times they're going to come back with, well, which one would you use? That's when you can say, well, personally, I find that I've had really good response on these 2. I generally don't just say one. But the other answer is all 3 of these are highly recommended by agents in our office, in our firm, okay? Because they've had good service. But the bottom line is you gotta get them thinking and you gotta get them directed as to which attorney they're gonna take their earnest money to. Then as you get into the accepted offer to purchase, it's already executed, then you're going to go back with the form and go through all these different inspections that they may be needing to order. Educate, educate, educate. I can't tell you how vital it is for you to spend time helping a buyer to understand why and when to use these different inspections. Now look at here, re-inspection. Sometimes buyers trust their own knowledge or they want to trust your knowledge when they do the final walkthrough or a re-inspect before the final walkthrough. They say, well, I can see if something's been fixed or whatever. Sometimes they want that inspector to go back. The inspector probably will charge $350 to maybe $700 or $800 initially. If they go back and re-inspect, it's typically half of what the original inspection was. So you might want to get some quotes on that if they're going to do a re-inspect. But again, if they want it, then you want them to initial. Let me show you right up here. I went past it. If they want it, they are going to initial there, and they're going to tell you to order it. If they're going to order it themselves, then it's going to be the buyers in here. And you can pre-populate some of these forms, maybe a template, because you know an appraisal is always ordered by a lender. If there is no lender involved, then in this cash sale, sometimes the buyer does want an appraisal, and in that situation, you probably will be ordering the appraisal. So you need to get permission from them for the appraisal. Otherwise, it's going to be a lender. So you can just put the lender in there. So if you want to, like I say, pre-populate. HPRA, I don't know if y'all are still doing it, Brenda, but y'all had a really good template with 3 or 4 providers listed so that the buyer could just circle or check, indicate which one they wanted to use. And that was a very good form that they had developed, and you all might want to do something similar. Now, notice right here, particularly anytime it's got a blue box around it, it's a note, it's pay attention. It's not a warning, but it's pay attention. Radon and other environmental testing is becoming more required. Buyers have become concerned about radon for years. I mean, we never had radon tests. We didn't even know we had radon in this area. But I got to tell you, we got radon in this area, and particular relocation companies started requiring it. And the more it was required, the more we found out, hey, we got some issues with radon. And we've got some people in town that do nothing but radon inspections. There's one called Mr. Radon. In fact, I talked to him the other day. But you might need to have a radon inspection. But just make sure that you pay attention to that little warning. There's also a warning on here, a note about a survey. Oh, please don't let people buy a house without a survey. And I know you can't make it, but you try to influence them. Why in the world would somebody pay $970,000 for a property and not even know where the property lines are? I don't understand it. You got to know what you're buying. And a survey is the way you know what you're buying. That survey is going to identify easements. It's going to identify encroachments. There are things that have to be done before a buyer buys the house. If it's on the survey, it needs to be taken care of sometime. You might as well get it done before your buyer takes possession of that property. It also has a lot to do with title insurance. As you talk about title insurance, right here in the middle, you see this right here, where it says, although title insurance companies may provide lender coverage without a new survey, the owner's policy contains an exception for easements, setbacks, and other matters. Do you know that Keller Williams Valentine has a joint venture with a title company? It's Heritage Title. I would just recommend that you make sure that buyers understand how important it is that they have an owner's title policy, not just the lender's title policy. The lender is going to require that. That's not an option. But a lot of buyers are putting sizable amounts of money. I mean, they may be putting $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 into a transaction. And if there's not an owner's title policy, if there's an issue, that $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 cash that went into the house is not covered. It's only the amount of the lender's coverage. So be a little bit more knowledgeable about title insurance, and I'll be glad to send you out some information if you want to send me an email so that you become a little bit more knowledgeable about title insurance. Okay. Now, again, this is the professional services disclosure, and I do expect it's a required form on all buyer sales. It's not required on listing sales, but it is required on all buyer sales. Now, this is an example of what I was mentioning to you a while ago. You can do a little template yourself, and you can make little notes about who would typically order it. You can list a few people here as far as what you might recommend. Again, this was just a sample for you to see. Told you I talked to Mr. Radon the other day. It was Andy Penny. Let's see. Let me go on down here. We're just about to, oh my goodness, we're out of time. It's a good thing I'm about there. I am there. Aha. Well, we have covered a gamut today, haven't we? I hope you've learned some things, and these are the forms that so often we don't necessarily cover on one of our Thursday afternoons, and you cover them in your T group, I'm sure. But I felt it was important. Some of you have been faithful to go through the process of writing the offer to purchase, and I thought you might need to have this little extra on your addendum. Any questions out there? Look at you shaking your head, Lori.
No questions.
And you mean I did a good job? I didn't confuse you?
It's a lot of information, but no confusion so far.
There's a lot to learn about these forms. I tell you, it's amazing how much you can learn. And I recommend that you read these forms at least once a month, whether you're using them or not. Keep yourself up to it. So, hey, Vicki, how's my girl?
Good. How are you?
Good to see you
too.
Well, y'all have a good evening and have a good weekend. And now next week, I think we're not going, next week we'd be on the South Carolina forums, and I think because of the holidays and so much going on, I'm not going to have those the Thursday classes for a couple of weeks, but we'll start up again in January, the first Thursday, okay? And I probably won't see you, and if I don't, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you at the party tomorrow night.
Yeah.
I say
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks for being with me. Okay.